After being erased from every family reunion for 10 straight years, I thought I'd finally learned how to live without them until the day they showed up at my doorstep uninvited, standing on the marble porch of the life they never believed I could build. I remember the way my hand froze on the door handle, not from fear, but from a kind of quiet anger that had aged with me. When I opened the door and saw their faces expecting the same old version of me they used to ignore, I didn't raise my voice, I didn't break. I just said one sentence. And watching the color drain from their cheeks felt like watching a decade of wounds finally speak for themselves. My name is Austin Vale. And before I share everything that led to that moment, I'd love to know you're here with me listening. Just say listening in the comments or tell me where you are right now. I love seeing how far my story can reach. Sometimes even the smallest connection makes a story feel heard. Thank you. And now, here's my story. And if you haven't yet, hit that subscribe button so you don't miss the next chapter. It means more than you know, especially to someone who spent years feeling invisible. By the time my family finally showed up at my front door, faces pale and eyes wide, I'd already spent 10 years learning how to live like I didn't have one. That moment on the marble porch of my new life didn't come out of nowhere. It started on an ordinary Tuesday at 7:42 a.m., in my glass-walled office in Soma, San Francisco, with an email that looked harmless and felt like a punch. The subject line was bright and chirpy: Brooksvale Family Reunion, Carmel Weekend. I clicked it out of habit, not hope. The RSVP list was neatly laid out, every cousin, every in-law, every loud uncle accounted for. My name wasn't there. Again, 10 years in a row. I scrolled twice just to be sure, even though I already knew. The familiar hollowness settled in my chest, that numb space where disappointment had learned to sit quietly. My phone lit up before I could close the laptop. Mom flashed on the screen. I stared at it for a second, then picked up. Austin's sweetheart, she started using that soft tone she reserved for bad news. She wanted to sound reasonable. About the reunion. The house just doesn't have enough room this year. You know how crowded it gets. I could see the Carmel house in my mind, 4 bedrooms, a pull-out couch, a deck big enough for 3 families. Right, I said. No room. It was the 10th time I'd heard some version of that sentence. The words had been sanded smooth by repetition, but they still scraped going down. She kept talking about sleeping arrangements, kids needing space, how Rowan's twins were a handful. I let her talk until she ran out of justifications. Sure, Mom, I said finally. I understand. I hung up, feeling anything but understanding. A buzz came a second later. Rowan, hey, Ori. I know this is awkward, but I hope you understand. It's just logistics. I stared at the screen at that word logistics and almost laughed. Rowan was the one who organized everything, the self-appointed COO of the family. If my name wasn't on the list, it wasn't an accident. I typed "no worries" and deleted it. I typed "I understand" and deleted that too. In the end, I didn't reply at all. Before I could toss my phone aside, it rang again. Danny's name popped up. I answered on the first ring. Let me guess, he said. You got the annual "no room at the inn" speech. I exhaled sharply through my nose. You betting on my trauma again? I told my coworker I had $20 on your mom using the exact same excuse. Don't make a liar out of me. His joke hit where it always did, that strange place between humor and hurt. You win, I said. She went with space this year. Classic. Man, he muttered, his voice softening. I'm sorry. Same people who raised you still don't see you. That's their loss, not yours. I stared out at the San Francisco skyline, the Bay Bridge cutting through a pale morning sky. Out there, I was Austin Vale, the guy with a corner office and a title that made LinkedIn jealous. In my family, I was the extra chair they kept in the garage just in case, but never brought inside. It's fine, I lied. I've got work. When the call ended, I leaned back in my chair and let my mind drag me somewhere I hadn't visited in a long time, the kitchen of the Carmel house 20 years earlier. I could smell the salt from the ocean and the butter from whatever my mom was burning in the oven. I was 10, standing on a step stool folding napkins into perfect triangles while laughter spilled in from the living room. Rowan's piano practice had been upgraded to a performance that night. The adults clapped every time she finished a piece, telling her she had real talent. Beck, younger than me but somehow always more important, was in the backyard with my stepdad Walter, learning how to throw a curveball for the big game that weekend. Every sound in that house had a direction. The music and the pride flowed toward Rowan. The cheers and the high fives flowed toward Beck. The only voice cutting into my space was my mother's floating in from the dining room. "Austin, keep those napkins neat. We don't have time to redo everything." My sketchbook lay open on the counter beside me, half a page filled with rough charcoal waves crashing against rocks. I'd asked earlier if I could bring it out onto the deck and draw the sunset. She hadn't looked up from her to-do list when she said no. That night, watching everyone move around each other like I wasn't even there, I realized something I couldn't put into words yet. I wasn't part of the show. I was backstage crew. That memory faded as my inbox pinged again, dragging me back to the present. I closed the reunion email without responding. 10 years of the same rejection had taught me one thing: my family had never made room for me, not really. I just didn't know yet how deep that truth ran, or how far they were willing to go to keep me on the outside. I did what I always do when something cracks inside me. I buried myself in work. By 9 o'clock, my screen was filled with projections and maps, the Austin expansion deck glowing in front of me. It was the biggest move our company had made in years, and I was the one in charge of making it make sense. Numbers were easy. They didn't pretend to love you while quietly pushing you away. Still, even cell formulas and growth charts couldn't drown out the echo of my mother's voice. I was so lost in it that I didn't notice someone standing in my doorway until I heard a soft knock on the glass. "You look like you're trying to kill that spreadsheet with your eyes," Theo said. He was in his late 50s, all silver hair and calm authority, the kind of man who made boardrooms go quiet without raising his voice. He'd been my mentor since my first year at the company. "Just fine-tuning the Austin models," I said, forcing a shrug. "Big week." Theo stepped in and closed the door behind him, then leaned against the frame with his arms crossed. "You know I've seen you present to a room full of investors without flinching," he said. "Today you look like you'd rather be anywhere but here. Talk to me." I stared at the slide in front of me, pretending to read a number I already knew by heart. "It's just family stuff," I said. "The reunion?" he asked almost casually. I glanced up, surprised. "You mentioned it once. Years ago," he added. "You were nervous about taking time off. Said it was a big deal for them to invite you." I let out a breath that sounded too close to a laugh. "Yeah, well, problem solved. They didn't." Theo's eyes softened. Still playing the "no room in the house" card, I nodded. Something in my chest tightened. He shook his head slowly. "You know you're not that kid in the kitchen anymore, right?" The image hit me so hard I didn't answer for a second. "What kid?" I asked, even though I knew. He lifted a shoulder, the one folding napkins while everyone else got applause. I don't know the details, but I've met enough people to recognize that look. For a moment, I couldn't speak. I hadn't told him that story. I hadn't told anyone. His words brushed against a scar I'd long pretended was just part of my skin. I swallowed. "Funny thing is," I said quietly, "they've managed to make me feel like that kid for a decade without even seeing me." Theo nodded once, like he understood more than I was saying. "Handle what you need to handle," he said. "But don't let people who never checked your homework be the ones who grade your life." When he left, I sat there with my palms pressed flat to the desk, heart pacing. I needed air and I needed answers. Maybe that's why I did what I did next. It started as a distraction. I opened a browser tab and typed Monterey County property tax search like it was nothing. I had checked in on the Carmel house before, just out of a morbid habit, but never dug too deep. This time something in me pushed further. Parcel number, owner name, assessed value. It was all public if you knew where to look. I scrolled, and that's when I saw it. 3 years of unpaid property taxes, 2 separate liens, a bright red status flag, at risk of default. I sat back hard. So while they'd been hosting reunions and telling me there wasn't enough space, the house itself had been sinking. I clicked deeper. Mortgage records, refinances, dates. They'd taken out a second loan against the house, then another. The numbers weren't small. The interest rates were ugly. My family, who loved to lecture me about stability and being responsible, had been playing financial roulette with the only real asset they had left, and somehow I was the only one who seemed to notice. My throat felt dry. I kept digging until I hit a scan from the county's legal office meeting notes from a call I wasn't on but probably should have been. One line near the bottom froze me. Family prefers to handle matter internally. Suggests avoiding involvement of Austin in financial discussions. Avoiding involvement of Austin. It was right there in black and white, a neat explanation for 10 years of polite exclusion. They hadn't kept me away to save space. They'd kept me away from the truth. For a long minute I just stared at that sentence, waiting for the anger to hit. It didn't. What came instead was something colder, heavier. A kind of clarity. All those years I'd wondered what was wrong with me, what made me so easy to leave out. Turned out the only thing they were trying to protect wasn't my feelings. It was their mess. I opened a new file and pulled up the form I'd used 100 times in deals for other people and offered a purchase in the name of a holding company. Vale Horizons LLC had been an idea for a future venture, a shell waiting for a purpose. Now it had one. I filled in the parcel number, the address I knew by heart, the offer price that would cover the debts, and then some. My hands didn't shake. If anything, they felt steadier than they had all morning. I didn't call Danny. I didn't run it by Theo. I didn't tell anyone. For once, this wasn't about a board or a team or consensus. It was about me reclaiming a place that had never wanted me but had shaped me anyway. 2 weeks later, I stood in the living room of the Carmel house as its legal owner. The truss beams above me were water-stained. The deck railing was rotting. The old piano in the corner was out of tune. The air smelled like dust and salt and something else, maybe the ghost of every version of me that had stood here trying to be seen. Outside, the ocean roared against the rocks like it always had, indifferent. I listened to it and made myself a promise this house would no longer be the stage for my humiliation. It would not be the backdrop for reunions I wasn't invited to. Whatever happened next, this place would not be where they erased me anymore. I had no idea that signing those papers was the first move in a war my family didn't even know we were in yet. After I signed the papers and the Carmel house legally became mine, I kept digging into the family's finances the same way a surgeon keeps checking for hidden bleeding after the operation. I told myself it was just to understand what I had gotten into, but the truth was simpler and heavier. I needed to know how deep the silence went. My parents had always presented themselves as the kind of people who managed their affairs well, the kind who lectured me on responsibility and financial literacy whenever I made a decision they didn't approve of. But the more I opened the files, the more the ground shifted. Nestled between the tax lines and overdue statements were transactions I didn't recognize, charges that didn't match the household expenses I remembered. Credit lines opened in different years, payments made inconsistently, amounts that were small on their own but alarming when added together. It felt like cracking open a door and discovering a room I never knew existed. As I scrolled through the scans, a memory I hadn't thought about in years rose up sharply. My high school graduation. I could still feel the late afternoon sun beating down on the football field, the scratchy gown sticking to my neck, the sound of hundreds of families cheering as names were called. When mine was announced, I looked into the bleachers out of instinct, expecting anything. But the space where my family should have been was empty. Later, I learned they had chosen to go to Beck's baseball game instead. He needed us more, my mother had said. I'd nodded like I understood, but standing alone on that field with my diploma in hand taught me a truth I didn't have words for. At 17, their silence wasn't incidental. It was deliberate. A choice. That same silence echoed now as I clicked through the financial records. One document hit harder than the rest, a stack of overdue notices tied to personal loans under my mother's name taken to bail Beck out of business attempts that had gone nowhere. The dates stretched back over several years, countless attempts to patch holes in a sinking ship. Every holiday, every time they had told me they were fine, every time they insisted I didn't need to worry, they had been lying. And worse, they'd been lying not to protect me, but to keep me out of it. I sat back in my chair staring at the total amount they owed, realizing it was precisely the kind of debt that could destroy a family home. They had let the Carmel house decay not from neglect but from decisions they made and didn't want me to know about. Another file sat quietly in the digital folder, almost too neat. The title alone made my stomach drop. Family Property Management Authorization. It was a scanned copy of a document Rowan had signed 3 years earlier, placing her as the point of contact for all decisions related to the house. I clicked it open and read line after line until my eyes reached the sentence that explained everything: request to consolidate family communication, streamline decision-making by reducing the number of participants involved. Beneath it, handwritten in a rushed, slanted script, was a note: exclude Austin from all internal meetings. My hands tightened around the edge of my desk. It wasn't an accident. It wasn't forgetfulness. They had carved me out, intentionally. The discovery peeled back another memory, one that lived in the walls of the Carmel house itself. I was 13, lying awake in the small upstairs bedroom that smelled like sun-dried wood and sea air. Waves crashed against the rocks outside, steady and indifferent. I heard laughter drifting up from downstairs, Rowan showing off a piano piece, Beck bragging about making the all-star team, my mother fussing over them both. I waited for someone to call my name, to ask where I was, to notice the quiet. No one did. That night I stared at the ceiling until it blurred, realizing for the first time that being forgotten hurt differently than being ignored. Forgotten meant they had already adjusted to my absence. Standing in the Carmel living room years later, the surf pounding outside the windows, I realized that ache had never left me. It had simply changed shape. I walked to the large window overlooking the beach, letting the cold air from a crack in the frame touch my skin. They didn't just forget me, I murmured. They erased me. The house creaked faintly, as if agreeing. The silence inside wasn't empty, it was purposeful. The truth was finally clear: I had never been left out by mistake. I had been removed. And now that I knew, everything that followed would be different. I flew back to San Francisco the next morning, determined to bury myself in work again. The Austin expansion demanded my attention, and focusing on logistics felt safer than wading through the emotional wreckage I'd uncovered. But as soon as my plane landed, my phone started vibrating nonstop. 3 missed calls from Beck. 2 messages from Rowan, both marked urgent. I didn't respond. They hadn't shown urgency in 10 years. Whatever suddenly mattered to them could wait until I found clarity. But clarity wasn't something they intended to give me. When I stepped into the lobby of my office, the receptionist gave me a strained smile and pointed toward the conference room. "Your family is here," she whispered, as if announcing an evacuation. I walked down the hallway and saw them through the glass, my mother sitting rigid in her chair, Rowan pacing with a stack of papers in her hand, and Beck staring at the table like he was waiting for a verdict. For a moment, I just watched them, noting how out of place they looked in the polished space where I spent most of my life. The moment I walked in, Rowan blurted, "You need to stop this." No greeting, no explanation, just a command. She shoved the papers into my hands, printouts of the property transfer, the liens I had paid off the deed, now under Vale Horizons. "Transfer it back," she said. "This isn't right." I let her words hang there before responding. "What part?" I asked. "The part where I saved the house you were about to lose, or the part where no one thought to tell me?" My mother leaned forward, her voice rising. "You had no right, Austin. That house is all we have left. You exploited us when we were vulnerable." I almost laughed at the absurdity. "Exploited," I repeated. 3 years of unpaid taxes, 2 loans, not a single word to me. "You didn't lose the house because of me. You lost it long before I stepped in." My mother's face went pale, and for the first time I saw fear flicker in her eyes. Before she could respond, Beck cleared his throat. His voice was thin. "It was me," he said. "The second loan, and the business stuff. I didn't tell anyone. I thought I could fix it before it became a problem." I stared at him. Beck had always been the golden boy, the one who got second, third, fourth chances. "And Mom knew?" I asked softly. She closed her eyes. "That told me everything." "I didn't want you to look down on him," she whispered. The irony was almost suffocating. "So you hid it from me," I said. "All of it. For years." She nodded, unable to meet my eyes. I exhaled slowly, the truth tightening around my ribs like a belt. "That's why I wasn't included," I said. "Not because there was no room. Because you didn't want me knowing what you were doing." Rowan stepped between us, then her face flushed. "I signed paperwork to manage the property. I suggested keeping you out of the meetings. You always question everything, Austin. You complicate things." She said it like it was a flaw, like being cautious was the reason they'd failed. My head felt strangely clear as I looked at all three of them. "If you wanted me gone, you should have just said it," I said calmly. "You didn't have to hide behind excuses." My mother leaned forward, desperation replacing anger. "We need you to keep this quiet," she said. "If people find out, it will ruin us." That was the moment something inside me shifted for good. "I'm not the one who ruined anything," I said. "And I'm not carrying the weight of your choices anymore." I stood gathering the papers. "Prove you're not the same people who shut me out for a decade," I said. "Not with excuses. With actions. If you want to fix this, start there." I walked out of the room, leaving them in the silence they had once used so effectively on me. But this time they were the ones sitting in it. I knew as the door closed behind me that the conflict between us had only begun, and none of us would come out the same. I drove back to my place in Lake Tahoe with the kind of exhaustion that sits behind your eyes and refuses to move. I didn't play music on the drive. I didn't call anyone. I just let the miles and the quiet stretch out in front of me. When I finally pulled into the driveway of the new house, a place I bought precisely because it was far from everything and everyone, I felt a brief sense of relief. Space, distance, air. I didn't have to share. All I wanted was one night to think without my family's voices pulling me back into the version of myself they'd always insisted on. But the universe clearly had other plans. As soon as I dropped my bag on the kitchen counter, the doorbell chimed. I froze. It was nearly 9 at night, and no one ever showed up here unannounced. I checked the security camera and my stomach tightened. All three of them stood on the porch, my mother, Rowan, and Beck, each holding luggage, looking like they'd run out of places to go. 3 hours earlier, they'd been in my office telling me to undo everything I'd done. Now they were at my door, faces, tight eyes, uncertain, as if expecting me to be grateful for the surprise. I opened the door slowly. "You're here," I said, my voice steady. To talk honestly this time, or to repeat the same rehearsed lines, they looked taken aback. Especially my mother, who had always assumed she controlled the tone of every conversation. They stepped inside, and suddenly the house felt even larger. The floor-to-ceiling windows, the open layout, the quiet elegance, they all seemed to make my family smaller, not me. For once, I wasn't the one shrinking. Rowan wandered into my office and stared at the wall of screens, the polished desk, the plaques I never talked about. "You work like this every day?" she asked softly. I didn't turn toward her. Every day. My mother stood near the staircase, taking everything in as if she were seeing me for the first time. "Why didn't you tell us you'd built all this?" I looked at her and said the simplest truth. "You never asked." She winced, but not enough to look away. Instead, she cleared her throat. "We need to talk about the Carmel house." She spoke carefully now, choosing each word like it mattered. "If you transfer the ownership back, we can discuss you joining us for reunion again." The offer landed in the room like a cold draft. I let out a slow breath. "So it's a negotiation," I said. "A transaction. Access to the family in exchange for real estate." I saw something shift in Beck's expression, guilt maybe, or panic. He rubbed the back of his neck before blurting out what neither of them planned to say. "Rowan wanted to come here because she needed to see how much money you actually have." My mother hissed his name, but it was too late. He kept going. "She thought you could maybe help cover the debt, or at least part of it." The truth hung there between us, heavy and sour. It wasn't me they'd driven all the way out here for. It was the hope that I was wealthy enough to fix everything they broke. I looked at them, my family, the people I once begged to notice me, and felt a clean, sharp line draw itself inside my chest. I'm not your rescue plan, I said quietly, and showing up at my door doesn't erase 10 years of shutting me out. My mother stepped forward, reaching for my arm like she used to when I was a child. We're trying to make things right, she said. I didn't move and she let her hand fall. Making things right starts with honesty, I said, not demands, not conditions. We ended up in the living room, my family on the couch looking small and out of place while I stood across from them. It struck me how different this was from every argument we'd had in the past. They weren't in control here. They weren't even close. They didn't have a single piece of leverage left except guilt, and I'd finally outgrown that too. They asked questions, they tried explanations, but I had reached the point where emotion didn't cloud clarity anymore. If you want to talk, really talk, I said, I'm here. But I'm done being the person you come to only when everything falls apart. They didn't argue. They just sat there silent, waiting for me to decide what came next. And for the first time in my life, I didn't feel like the child in the corner. I felt like someone whose presence mattered, someone with power, someone they couldn't ignore anymore. As I looked at them in the dim light of my living room, I could feel something shifting, rising like a storm that had been building for years. This wasn't just conflict anymore. It was the beginning of a reckoning I knew none of us were prepared for. A day later, after a night of barely sleeping and hours of circling thoughts, I made a decision. If my family was going to understand who I had become and what they had lost by keeping me out, they needed to see my world not as outsiders trying to take something from me, but as people finally forced to confront the truth. So I invited them to dinner at the Ritz-Carlton in Half Moon Bay, the same place where I often met investors and clients who trusted me with decisions far larger than anything my family had ever allowed me to handle. The drive along the coast was quiet. The hotel rose from the cliffs like something pulled from a postcard, all stone and glass and evening light. Inside the dining room, the chandeliers glowed softly above white tablecloths and tall windows that framed the ocean. My family walked in and immediately stiffened, overwhelmed by a world they didn't even know I belonged to. They tried to hide it, but I saw the way their eyes widened, the way their shoulders pulled back. We sat down, and before I could say anything, a familiar voice cut through the room. Austin, Theo said, walking toward us with a warm smile. I'm glad I caught you. He turned to my mother and extended his hand. Your son is one of the strongest candidates for our executive committee, a future leader in the making. I didn't need to look at my family to know their expressions. Shock, disbelief, pride they hadn't earned. For a moment, no one spoke. When Theo left, my mother leaned in. Why didn't you tell me any of this? She asked. Her voice was small and, for once, not demanding. I met her eyes. Because you didn't want to hear it, I said. Every time I tried, you changed the subject, or redirected it to Rowan, or Beck. Dinner arrived, but no one touched their plates. My family seemed too busy watching the room, absorbing the reality that I actually belonged here. Halfway through the meal, Rowan stood abruptly and motioned for me to follow. In the hallway, she crossed her arms. Beck didn't tell you everything she said. He didn't just take out loans. He used the house as collateral again a few months ago. My stomach tightened. Mom didn't know about that part, she added. He was afraid you'd find out, especially after you started asking questions. I nodded slowly. So if I hadn't bought it, I said the bank would have. Rowan looked away, probably by the end of the year. For a moment, neither of us moved. Then she whispered, I'm not proud of how we handled things. Back at the table, I told them what I knew. I laid out every detail, every debt, every secret, every lie they'd told themselves about protecting me or protecting each other. The truth sat between us like a heavy stone. My mother put her fork down and pressed a hand to her chest. I didn't keep you out because I didn't care, she said. I kept you out because I knew how capable you were. I thought if you got involved, everything you touched would outshine your brother and sister. I couldn't risk breaking the balance. Her words hit harder than any accusation she'd thrown at me. The balance. The idea that I needed to dim so they could shine. I felt anger rise, but beneath it was something older, a grief I'd been carrying since childhood. I spent 30 years trying to earn a place you'd already decided I couldn't have, I said quietly. No one spoke after that. The silence wasn't dismissive this time. It was stunned. Exposed. Real. I stood and walked toward the balcony outside the dining hall. The night air was cold, the waves crashing far below. For the first time since this all began, I didn't feel invisible. I felt seen, even if it hurt. My family remained inside, too shaken to move, and I let the darkness and the ocean steady me. The conflict had reached a point where words alone couldn't carry it anymore. This was the threshold, the edge of what we had been and what we might become. I didn't know if this was a beginning or an ending. All I knew was that nothing about us would ever return to how it was before. I returned to Lake Tahoe after the tense dinner at the Ritz-Carlton, carrying the weight of everything said and everything left unsaid. Something in me knew my family hadn't told the whole truth. The house was quiet when I tried to sleep, but my mind refused to settle. Near midnight, I heard a knock at my door. My mother stood there with a wooden box I recognized instantly, the one she kept hidden in the Carmel attic. She sat beside me and opened it slowly. Inside were pieces of my childhood I never knew. She saved newspaper clippings from science fairs I'd won, my old STEM medal, blurry photos taken of me from backstage. For years I thought she never cared enough to keep anything of mine. Seeing it now knocked the breath out of me. Then she confessed something I never saw coming. She had intentionally downplayed my accomplishments because she feared that if I grew too fast, I'd leave her the same way my father did. I felt the floor shift. All my life I thought he'd left because of me, because I wasn't enough. She explained he left because of pressure she put on him, not because of me. Decades of misplaced guilt shattered in that moment. Footsteps sounded at the door. Rowan had overheard. Her face was pale as she realized the truth she had never imagined. She had resented me for years because she assumed I was the favorite, when in reality I was the one our mother feared losing. "I wasn't angry at you," she said quietly. "I was angry at a story I made up." For the first time we stood face to face, without hostility, only hurt and understanding. My mother reached for my hand, asking for forgiveness. She admitted she didn't deserve yet. "I want to fix this," she said. "I'm ready to change." I told her forgiveness couldn't come overnight. If they wanted a place in my life, it had to be earned through actions, not promises. Later, alone on the balcony overlooking the still lake, I felt myself standing at a crossroads: remain alone or give them one final chance to meet me where I truly was. Morning sunlight filled the Tahoe house as I packed for Austin, where I was set to take on my new role as Regional Strategy Director. It was the biggest step of my career, one I fought for alone. When I came downstairs, my family waited in the entryway, quieter and more subdued than I had ever seen them. Rowan approached first, handing me the authorization papers she once used to cut me out of family decisions. "If you'll have me, I want you involved, really involved. No more hiding, no more control." Beck stepped forward next. He admitted the debt was worse than what I had discovered, and said he wasn't asking for money, only guidance to rebuild without leaning on anyone. It was the first real accountability I'd ever heard from him. Then my mother placed the old Carmel key in my hand. "The house is yours," she said softly. "Whatever you choose to do with it, we'll respect." It wasn't a negotiation. It was acceptance, finally. I told them I would keep the house, but not as a symbol of exclusion. I'd keep it as a place to start over on my terms. And I added one condition: reunions from now on would alternate between Austin and Carmel. If they wanted me in the family, they had to step into my world the same way they expected me to step into theirs. To my surprise, they all agreed immediately. No pushback, no bargaining, just sincerity. When I loaded my suitcase into the car, they walked beside me, not ahead, not behind, but beside. For the first time, we stood on level ground. As I drove away, looking one last time at the Tahoe house glowing in the morning light, I realized I didn't know exactly what the future held for us. But the difference now was simple and profound. For the first time in 30 years, the choice was mine. I headed toward Austin with both old memories and a new beginning, one I had opened for myself. As the road opened in front of me, I realized something I had never allowed myself to believe before: healing doesn't always come from grand gestures. Sometimes it comes from the quiet decision to stop carrying what was never yours. My family wasn't suddenly perfect, and the past didn't disappear. But for the first time, I wasn't walking toward my future with my head turned backward. I was driving toward a life I built on ground I earned with boundaries I finally understood how to protect. And maybe that's the real lesson here. You can't choose the family you're born into, but you can choose the role you play in your own story. You can choose what to hold on to, what to release, and when to open the door to something better, even if it means opening it alone. If you're listening right now, wherever you are, maybe in your room on a late-night drive or sitting somewhere quiet, I'd love to know you're here with me. Drop a simple listening in the comments, or tell me where you're tuning in from. I read every message, and it means more than you think. And if this story resonated with you, if it made you feel seen in any way, don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the next chapter. We're building a place for stories like this, stories about choosing yourself, finding strength, and rewriting what family can mean. Thank you for being here. It matters more